At just 25, Hannah Whitmore was 6 months pregnant when her husband abandoned her. 3 weeks later, her father died, leaving her with only $220 overdue rent and a rusted old ambulance everyone called worthless. But when Hannah tried to sell her father's inheritance for scrap, she discovered a hidden compartment containing 43 217 tons secret journals and a letter with her name on it. What her father had hidden for 20 years would change everything. Stay until the end and subscribe if you believe the people we lose can still leave behind a miracle. When Samuel Whitmore died after 38 years as a paramedic, his children divided what he left behind in less than a week. The house was listed 4 days after the funeral. The savings were divided before the flowers on his grave had even begun to wilt. His son, Dylan, took the pickup truck, the tools, the furniture, and almost everything anyone believed was worth keeping. His daughter Hannah got what nobody wanted: a rusted 1998 ambulance, 3 cardboard boxes filled with her father's old uniforms, and a set of keys to a vehicle she couldn't even afford to tow. Hannah Whitmore was only 25 years old. She was 6 months pregnant, and 3 weeks earlier her husband had abandoned her. He packed 2 suitcases while she stood in their tiny apartment, one hand pressed against the small of her back and the other resting over the child growing inside her. There had been no screaming, no broken dishes, no dramatic goodbye. He simply placed his wedding ring on the kitchen counter and said the words Hannah would hear in her head every night afterward. "I can't do this." Then he walked out. Hannah remembered staring at the ring long after the door closed. Her baby kicked beneath her ribs. She placed both hands over her stomach and whispered, "It's okay." But she didn't know whether she was speaking to her unborn child or trying to convince herself. By the time her father died, Hannah had $212 left in her bank account. Her rent was overdue. Prenatal bills were stacked unopened beside the kitchen sink. The refrigerator held half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and whatever she could stretch until payday, a payday that wasn't coming. Because Hannah hadn't worked as a nurse in 7 months. 7 months earlier, a 16-year-old boy had died while she was trying to save him. 4 minutes. That was the part she could never escape. 4 minutes waiting for emergency medication while the boy struggled to breathe. 4 minutes Hannah replayed every night, changing every decision in her mind, searching desperately for a version where she moved faster, shouted louder, broke the cabinet open, did anything that ended with that boy going home to his mother. But there was no different ending. There was only the memory of his hand slowly going limp inside hers. Hannah left the hospital the following week. She told everyone it was temporary. Then 1 month became 3. 3 became 7. Her scrubs stayed buried in the back of her closet. Her nursing license remained inside a kitchen drawer, and Hannah slowly stopped recognizing the woman she had once been. Then her husband left. Then her father died. 3 losses, one after another. Her career, her marriage, her father, and through all of it, the little girl inside her kept growing. In 3 months, Hannah would become a mother. She had no husband beside her, almost no money, no job, and now, no father to call when she was afraid. So on a bitter Saturday morning, Hannah drove to a storage lot on the edge of town to sell Samuel's old ambulance for scrap. She wasn't looking for memories. She wasn't looking for some final message from her father. She needed money, enough to pay the storage bill, enough to buy groceries, enough to keep the heat running, enough, maybe, to survive another week. The ambulance sat between an abandoned RV and an old fishing boat, its red and white paint faded by years of sun and winter. Rust circled the wheel wells. One side mirror was held together with electrical tape. Dylan had called it scrap metal on wheels. Looking at it now, Hannah couldn't disagree. She unlocked the rear doors and pulled them open. The smell hit her immediately. Antiseptic, old vinyl, machine oil, and beneath all of it, Her father. Hannah froze. For one painful second, she could see Samuel coming home after another 16-hour shift. Dropping his keys beside the door and asking her the same question he had asked since she was a child. Did you eat? Never. How was school? Never. Did you miss me? Always. Did you eat? That was how Samuel Whitmore said, I love you. Hannah lowered herself onto the bench seat. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. She rested one hand over her belly. I could really use you right now. Dad. Silence. Hannah wiped her face and forced herself back to work. She opened cabinets, emptied drawers, collected old paperwork. Then she moved toward the stretcher mount. Her fingers brushed against something beneath the rail. Metal. Hannah stopped. She looked closer. There was a seam in the floor. It shouldn't have been there. She knelt carefully, awkwardly shifting the weight of her 6-month pregnancy, and ran her fingertips along the edge. Then she found a latch, painted the same gray as the floor, almost invisible. Her heartbeat changed. Dylan had already searched the ambulance. He said there was nothing valuable inside. But this wasn't factory equipment. Someone had built it deliberately. Someone had hidden it deliberately. And that someone had been her father. Hannah pulled the latch. Click! A section of the floor lifted. Beneath it was a steel compartment welded directly into the ambulance chassis. Hannah stared into the darkness. For a moment, she forgot about the rent, the medical bills, her husband, even the scrapyard. Because inside that compartment were 3 worn leather journals, a bundle of old letters, legal documents, a bank passbook, and one plain white envelope. Hannah reached toward it with a trembling hand. Across the front, written in the unmistakable handwriting of the father she had buried only days earlier, was a single name. Hannah! She stopped breathing. Samuel Whitmore had spent 38 years saving strangers. But before he died, he had hidden something inside this ambulance specifically for his 25-year-old pregnant daughter. Something her brother knew nothing about. Something Hannah had never been meant to find until Samuel was gone. And when she finally opened that envelope, she would discover that the rusted ambulance everyone considered worthless wasn't the smallest part of her inheritance. It was the beginning of a secret her father had kept for more than 20 years. A secret that was about to change Hannah's life. And the life of the unborn child she was now terrified of raising alone. Hannah stared at the envelope for several seconds before touching it. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable. The capital H leaned slightly to the right. The final letters were pressed harder into the paper, exactly the way Samuel had written her name on birthday cards, school forms, and lunch bags when she was little. Hannah, not Dylan. Not to my children, just Hannah. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the envelope from the compartment. The baby moved inside her. Hannah instinctively placed one hand over her stomach. I know, she whispered. I'm scared. Too. But she didn't open the letter. Not yet. Instead, she reached deeper into the compartment and pulled everything out, one piece at a time. 3 leather journals, a bundle of envelopes tied together with an old rubber band, a manila folder filled with legal papers, and finally, a green bank passbook from Ridgemont Savings and Loan. Hannah opened it. The first deposit had been made more than 20 years earlier. $300. After that came smaller deposits. $50, $75, sometimes $100. Never enough to attract attention. Month after month. Year after year. Her eyes moved down the page until she reached the final balance. 43 217s. Hannah stopped. She checked the number again. Then a third time. Her father had lived simply his entire life. Samuel wore work boots until the soles separated. He repaired his own appliances. He clipped grocery coupons at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings and complained when coffee went up 20 cents. Yet somehow, quietly, patiently, He had saved more than 43,000 tollers in an account nobody knew existed. Hannah thought about the $212 in her own bank account, the overdue rent, the prenatal bills, the little crib she had looked at online 3 nights earlier and closed the page because even the cheapest one felt impossible. Her throat tightened. "Dad, what were you doing?" She opened the manila folder. A property deed slid into her lap. 614 Greer Street, a commercial building on the east side of Ridgemont. Purchased 9 years earlier. Cash. Owner Samuel Whitmore. Hannah stared at the document. Her father owned a building. Not Dylan. Not the estate. Samuel. And beneath the deed, in his handwriting, were 5 words. Held in trust for Hannah. That was when she finally opened the letter. "Dear Hannah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone." Her vision blurred immediately. She stopped, pressed the paper against her chest, closed her eyes. For the first time since the funeral, she wanted something impossible with the desperation of a child. She wanted her father back. Not his money, not his building, not his ambulance. Just Samuel. One more cup of coffee at his kitchen table. One more phone call she could answer instead of letting it go to voicemail. One more chance to tell him she was afraid. Hannah wiped her face and kept reading. Her father explained that for more than 20 years, he had used the old ambulance on his days off. Tuesdays, Thursdays, some weekends. He drove to migrant farm camps outside town. He stopped beneath the Route 9 overpass, where homeless men and women slept. He visited elderly people who lived miles from their nearest neighbor. He cleaned wounds, checked blood pressure, brought oxygen, delivered medicine when he could, and he never charged anyone. Hannah slowly looked around the ambulance. Suddenly, everything felt different. The worn bench wasn't just an old seat. People had sat there frightened and sick, perhaps with nowhere else to go. The scratched cabinets had once held bandages and medicine. The metal rail beside her had carried IV bags. The vehicle Dylan had dismissed as scrap metal had been something else entirely. For more than 20 years, it had been a place where desperate people found Samuel Whitmore waiting for them. Hannah reached for the first leather journal and opened it. Names filled the pages. Dates, locations, treatments, follow-up visits. A farm worker with a deep cut across his forearm. An elderly widow who had fallen inside her home and couldn't afford another hospital bill. A homeless man with an infected wound Samuel cleaned every other day for 2 weeks. A frightened mother whose little girl had pneumonia. Samuel had written about all of them with the same careful attention. Not as cases, as people. Hannah turned another page. Then another. Her father had spent his life saving strangers, and somehow his own children had known almost nothing about it. She returned to the letter. The next paragraph made her stop breathing again. Samuel wrote about the building on Greer Street. He had bought it with the money he saved over the years and had been repairing it little by little. New plumbing, electrical work, walls for exam rooms, a waiting area. His dream was simple. A small community clinic where people without insurance or money could walk through the door and receive help without being turned away. Then came the sentence Hannah wasn't prepared for. "I was building it for you." Her hand flew to her mouth. The baby kicked again. This time, Hannah began to cry. Samuel knew she had left nursing. He knew something had happened at the hospital, even though Hannah had never found the courage to tell him the whole story. And somehow, he had known she was hurting. The letter continued. He told her that 30 years earlier, he had lost a woman during a cardiac emergency on the side of a highway. For decades, he had remembered her name, her face, the sound of her husband's voice. He had wondered whether one faster decision might have saved her. Then Samuel wrote the words Hannah needed more than she realized. "You don't forget the people you couldn't save. You don't stop carrying them. You simply learn that carrying them doesn't mean you have to stop walking. Hannah lowered the letter. For 7 months, she had believed leaving nursing was the only way to escape the 16-year-old boy whose hand had gone limp inside hers. But her father had carried his own loss for 30 years, and he had still kept showing up. Again, and again, and again. At the bottom of the letter, Samuel had written one final request. Finish what I started. The building, the money, the ambulance. They were meant for Hannah, not as an inheritance she could spend. As a beginning, Hannah sat alone in the cold ambulance, 6 months pregnant, abandoned by her husband, unemployed, nearly broke, and terrified of becoming a mother without knowing how she would survive the next 3 months. That morning, she had come there hoping to sell an old ambulance for a few $100s. Instead, her dead father had placed an unfinished dream in her hands. And for the first time in 7 months, Hannah felt something beneath the grief. Not confidence? Not yet. Something smaller, more fragile, but alive. Hope? Then she looked at the bundle of letters still lying inside the hidden compartment. There were more than 30 of them. Different handwriting, different names. Different years? All addressed to Samuel. Hannah picked up the first one, and before she had finished reading the opening lines, she realized the 43 daughters wasn't the real secret her father had left behind. The real secret was the number of lives he had quietly changed. And Hannah was only beginning to discover just how many there were. Hannah opened the first letter. The paper was yellow at the edges, folded so many times that the creases had nearly worn through. The handwriting was slow and uneven. Dear Mr. Whitmore, you probably don't remember me, but you came to our trailer when my daughter couldn't breathe. Hannah stopped. She kept reading. The woman wrote that her little girl had developed a terrible cough during a winter when the family had no insurance and barely enough money for food. Samuel had driven nearly 30 miles after his shift ended, listened to the child's lungs, brought medicine, and returned twice to make sure the fever had broken. At the bottom were 7 words. My daughter is alive because you came. Hannah pressed her lips together. She opened another. This one came from a veteran Samuel had driven to a VA hospital at 3 in the morning after finding him alone beneath an overpass. Another was written on the back of a grocery receipt. You checked on me every Thursday after my husband died. Nobody else did. Thank you. Then Hannah found one written in a child's handwriting. Mr. Sam, thank you for fixing my arm. Below the words was a crayon drawing of a white ambulance with a red stripe and a stick figure standing beside it. Hannah's tears fell onto the page. She quickly wiped them away. These weren't thank you notes. Not really. They were pieces of lives her father had touched without ever coming home and talking about them. Hannah had spent 25 years believing Samuel Whitmore was simply a tired county paramedic who worked too much and spoke too little. Now she was beginning to understand why he had always looked so tired. He had been carrying people none of them knew existed. She read until the cold inside the ambulance reached her hands. Then she remembered the address. 614 Greer Street. Hannah gathered the journals, letters, bank passbook, and legal documents into an old canvas medical bag she found behind the driver's seat. She locked the ambulance and drove east. Greer Street wasn't somewhere Hannah normally stopped. Auto shops. A laundromat. A discount grocery store. Small brick buildings with faded signs. Then she saw 614. Hannah slowed. The building was modest. 1 story. Brick front. Plywood-covered 2 windows, and an old for lease sign remained behind the glass, even though Samuel had apparently owned the property for 9 years. Hannah parked for several seconds. She stayed behind the wheel. Her father had come here, maybe hundreds of times. He had stood behind that door planning something for her, while Hannah lived less than 30 minutes away. She suddenly wondered how many times Samuel had called and she'd said, "Dad, I'm busy. Can I call you later?" How many times had later never come? The thought hurt more than she expected. Hannah stepped out carefully, one hand beneath her belly, and walked toward the entrance. A key from the manila folder fit the lock. Before she could turn it, someone shouted from across the street. "Hey!" Hannah froze. A stocky man in his late 50s was crossing from an auto repair shop, wiping grease from his hands. He stopped when he saw her face. "You're Samuel's daughter." Hannah tightened her grip on the keys. "How do you know that?" The man's expression softened. "Because you have his eyes?" His name was Frank Morales. And the next thing he said made Hannah forget about the locked door. "Your father saved my life." Years earlier, Frank had collapsed from cardiac arrest at a construction site during a brutal summer afternoon. Samuel wasn't working. He had been driving the old ambulance toward one of the farm camps when he saw workers waving desperately from the roadside. Samuel stopped. Frank's heart had already stopped beating. For 11 minutes, Samuel performed CPR until the county ambulance arrived. 11 minutes. Frank touched his chest as he told the story. "Everything I've had since that afternoon, my wife, my daughter, every Christmas, every mornings I've opened that shop, your father gave me the chance to see it." Hannah couldn't speak. Frank looked toward the ambulance in the distance. "After that, I started maintaining his rig." Hannah stared at him. "You maintained it? Every 2 weeks, oil, battery, tires, fluids, whatever Samuel needed." That explained the checklist. The clean cabinets, the oiled stretcher rail. Her father had been preparing the ambulance until the final weeks of his life. Frank nodded toward the building. "He was preparing that, too." Hannah unlocked the door. Inside, sunlight slipped through narrow gaps around the plywood. The room smelled of lumber and dust. A reception counter had been partially built along one wall. Behind it were 2 unfinished exam rooms. New electrical wiring ran through exposed studs. Plumbing had already been roughed in for a sink. In the back corner, Hannah found a locked storage closet. Another key opened it. Inside were boxes of exam gloves, gauze, a blood pressure cuff, bandages, and on the top shelf, a brand new stethoscope. Hannah stared at it. 7 months. She hadn't touched one in 7 months. Her hand moved toward it, then stopped. Suddenly, she wasn't standing inside her father's unfinished clinic. She was back in the hospital. A 16-year-old boy was struggling for air. His frightened eyes were looking directly into hers. The monitor screamed. His fingers tightened around her hand, then loosened. Hannah stumbled backward. Her hand went immediately to her stomach. "Hannah?" Frank stepped toward her. "I'm okay." She wasn't. She could barely breathe. Then her baby moved. One slow kick beneath her palm. Hannah closed her eyes. Alive. Her daughter was alive. Growing inside the body Hannah had spent 7 months believing had failed someone. She stood there until her breathing slowed. When Hannah finally opened her eyes, Frank was still waiting. He hadn't touched her, hadn't demanded an explanation. He had simply stayed, just like Samuel would have. Then Hannah's phone rang. Dylan. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "I got some of Dad's forwarded mail," he said. "Property tax notice, commercial building on Greer Street." Hannah looked around the unfinished clinic. "What about it?" A pause. Then Dylan's voice changed. "If Dad owned another property..." "Hannah, that's part of the estate." Her hand tightened around the phone. There it was. Not grief. Not curiosity. Money. "You already divided the estate." "That was before I knew he was hiding assets." Hannah looked at the unfinished exam rooms. "At the medical supplies." At the stethoscope her father had bought for a clinic he knew he might never live to open. Then she remembered the words on the deed. Held in trust, for Hannah. It isn't yours, Dylan. Silence. What did you just say? Hannah felt her daughter move again. This time she didn't lower her eyes. For 7 months, Hannah had felt as though everyone and everything in her life was leaving. Her patient, her career, her husband, her father. But standing inside Samuel's unfinished clinic, she realized her father hadn't simply left her something valuable. He had trusted her with something worth protecting. And for the first time since her husband walked out, Hannah heard strength return to her own voice. I said it isn't yours. Dylan went silent. Then he said 5 words that turned Hannah's grief into something else entirely. We'll see about that. Hannah. The call ended. Hannah slowly lowered the phone. Frank was watching her. Outside, traffic moved along Greer Street as though nothing had happened. But Hannah knew something had. Her brother had just discovered the secret. And suddenly, the unfinished clinic her father had spent years building wasn't only a gift. It was something Hannah might have to fight to keep. For the next 3 days, Hannah barely slept. Dylan's words followed her everywhere. We'll see about that. A month earlier, they might have frightened her enough to walk away. Maybe she would have handed him the papers and told herself she didn't have the strength to fight. But something had changed. Every night after the apartment grew quiet, Hannah sat at her kitchen table with Samuel's journals spread around her. She read until her back ached and her unborn daughter shifted impatiently beneath her ribs. Page after page, she discovered a father she had somehow known her entire life without ever truly knowing at all. Samuel wrote about people Hannah had never met. Not dramatically. Not like a man trying to be remembered. Just simple notes. Mrs. Carter's blood pressure is improving. Bring insulin samples to Thomas on Thursday. Check Maria's little boy again next week. Under one entry, Samuel had written, she apologized for not having money. I told her being sick isn't something a person should have to apologize for. Hannah read that sentence 3 times. Then she closed her eyes. She remembered being 12 years old and angry because Samuel missed her school recital. She remembered being 17 and embarrassed when he arrived at graduation wearing the same worn brown jacket he'd owned for years. She remembered all the birthdays when he came late, all the dinners that went cold, all the times she'd thought work mattered more to him than his family. Now she understood. Sometimes Samuel hadn't been working. Sometimes he'd been sitting beside an elderly man who had nobody else. Sometimes he'd been cleaning the wound of someone who couldn't afford a doctor. Sometimes he'd been driving 30 miles because a frightened mother had nowhere else to turn. The realization didn't erase Hannah's childhood disappointments, but it changed their shape. Her father hadn't loved his family less. His heart had simply made room for people the rest of the world had forgotten. On Thursday morning, Hannah drove to St. Matthew's Community Pantry after finding the address repeated dozens of times in Samuel's journals. A silver-haired woman named Eleanor Price was arranging canned food when Hannah introduced herself. The can in Eleanor's hand slipped onto the table. Samuel's Hannah. Before Hannah could answer, Eleanor wrapped her arms around her. Hannah froze. Then Eleanor began crying. Not politely. Not quietly. She held Hannah as though she had been waiting to do it since the funeral. Your father talked about you all the time. Hannah pulled back. He did. Eleanor smiled through her tears. Oh, honey, you were his favorite subject? Something inside Hannah cracked. Samuel had never been good with words. He rarely said he was proud of her. Rarely said he missed her. But according to Eleanor, he had told everyone about the day Hannah became a nurse. He carried a picture of you in your scrubs, Eleanor said, showed it to anyone who would stand still long enough. Hannah laughed once, then covered her mouth as tears came. For years, she'd mistaken her father's silence for distance. Now, after he was gone, Strangers were translating his love for her. Eleanor showed Hannah the small room where Samuel had treated people twice a week. There was an old folding table, 2 plastic chairs, a dented medical cabinet. Nothing impressive. Yet people began arriving when they heard Samuel's daughter was there. A farm worker named Louise shook Hannah's hand and told her Samuel had treated an infected cut that could have cost him his hand. An elderly woman named Dorothy said Samuel checked on her every winter after her husband died. Then a young mother approached, carrying a little girl with dark curls. "This is Lily," she said. Hannah looked at the child. The mother was crying. "Your dad came to our trailer when she couldn't breathe." Hannah's heart stopped. "The first letter? The little girl with pneumonia. She was standing right there. Alive." Lily hid behind her mother's coat, then slowly peeked out. Hannah crouched as far as her pregnant belly allowed. "Hi, Lily." The little girl smiled. That tiny smile broke something open inside her. For 7 months, Hannah had measured herself by one life she couldn't save. One 16-year-old boy. One terrible night. One outcome she would have changed if she'd been given the power. But standing in that pantry, Hannah saw another truth. Medicine wasn't only about the people you lost. It was also about the people who went home. The birthdays they reached. The children they raised. The ordinary mornings they got to wake up and complain about traffic and burnt toast because somebody had shown up when they were in trouble. Her father had understood that. Maybe that was why he kept going. On the drive home, Hannah cried almost the entire way. But these tears felt different. They weren't only grief. That night, she opened the drawer in her kitchen. Her nursing license was exactly where she'd left it. Beneath it lay her hospital badge. Hannah picked it up. The photograph showed a woman she barely recognized. Confident eyes. Hair pulled back. A small smile. She touched the picture with her thumb. "I don't know if I can be her again," she whispered. Her daughter kicked. Hannah smiled through her tears. "Yeah, I know. You keep having opinions." For the first time in months, she laughed. A real laugh. Small and shaky, but real. Then she took Samuel's letter from the table and read his words again. "You don't forget the people you couldn't save. You simply learn that carrying them doesn't mean you have to stop walking." Hannah rested one hand over her daughter. Maybe healing didn't mean forgetting that boy. Maybe returning to nursing wouldn't betray him. Maybe the best way to honor a life she couldn't save was to keep showing up for the lives she still could. The next morning, Hannah drove back to 614 Greer Street. Frank was already there. He looked surprised when she walked inside. Hannah stood in the unfinished waiting room and looked at the exposed walls, the dusty floor, and the exam rooms her father had never lived long enough to finish. For the first time, she didn't see an inheritance. She didn't see 42 beneficent intentorists. She didn't see property Dylan might try to take. She saw frightened mothers, lonely elderly people, workers without insurance, children like Lily, people waiting for someone to show up. Hannah placed Samuel's old medical bag on the unfinished reception counter. Frank watched her quietly. "What are you thinking?" Hannah looked around the room. Then she placed both hands over the daughter growing inside her. Her father was gone. Her husband wasn't coming back. Her old life had collapsed. But maybe starting over wasn't the same thing as starting with nothing. Samuel had left her walls. He had left her money. He had left her an ambulance. More importantly, he had left her a reason to stand up again. Hannah looked at Frank. Her voice trembled. But the answer didn't. "I'm thinking we finish it." Frank stared at Hannah for a long moment. Then he looked around the unfinished clinic. Exposed wiring hung from the walls. Dust covered the concrete floor. One exam room didn't even have a door yet. "You mean finish the building?" Hannah nodded. "All of it." Frank studied her face as if trying to decide whether grief had made her reckless. "Hannah, your father worked on this place for years." "I know. It won't be easy. I know that, too." And you're 6 months pregnant. Hannah looked down at her belly. Her daughter shifted beneath her sweater. For the first time, those words didn't make her feel fragile. They made her feel like she had a deadline. Then we'd better start. Frank smiled. It was small at first. Then he laughed. Yeah, he said, that's Samuel's daughter. They started that morning. Not with construction. With a list. Plumbing. Electrical work. Drywall. Paint. Cabinets. Medical equipment. Licensing. Insurance. Permits. By lunchtime, Hannah was staring at 3 pages of expenses. The 43 Dow 217 Samuel had saved suddenly didn't seem like much. She calculated everything twice. Then a third time. Even if she spent every dollar her father left, they would still come up short. That night, Hannah sat alone at her kitchen table with a calculator, unpaid bills on one side and Samuel's journals on the other. Her own rent was overdue. Her prenatal appointment was the following week. She needed a crib, diapers, a car seat. Everything inside her told her to protect the money. Keep it! Survive. Her hand rested over her daughter. What am I doing? She whispered. Then her eyes fell on one of Samuel's journal entries. A single sentence was underlined. If you wait until you have enough to help somebody, you'll always find a reason to wait. Hannah stared at it. Then she cried, because even dead, her father somehow knew exactly where to find her. The next morning, she transferred the first $8,000 into a renovation account. It terrified her. But something happened 2 days later that Hannah hadn't expected. Frank arrived with 3 men. One was an electrician. One was a plumber. The third owned a small construction company. Hannah looked at them. I can't afford all of you. The electrician shook his head. You're not paying me. Hannah frowned. He explained that 12 years earlier, Samuel had found his father unconscious in a grocery store parking lot and stayed with him until help arrived. The plumber had another story. Samuel had treated his son's infected leg when the family had no insurance. The contractor simply said, Your dad helped my wife. By Friday, there were 11 people working inside 614 Greer Street. Nobody sent an invoice. Eleanor arrived with sandwiches. Louise brought lumber. Dorothy sat in the unfinished waiting room folding donated towels, even though Hannah repeatedly told her she didn't have to. I know, Dorothy said. That's why I'm doing it. Hannah had to turn away so nobody saw her cry. Everywhere she looked, her father's kindness was coming back. Not as money, as people. A life Samuel had spent giving away was returning piece by piece through the hands of those who remembered. Within 2 weeks, the clinic changed. Drywall covered the exposed studs. The plumbing worked. Lights came on in both exam rooms. Someone donated 6 waiting room chairs. A retired physician offered 2 examination tables. A pharmacy representative Eleanor knew promised basic supplies for the first 6 months. And Hannah began doing something she hadn't done in a very long time. Planning for a future. She contacted the state nursing board. Her license could be reactivated. She would need continuing education and updated certifications. The email sat open on her screen for 20 minutes before she finally clicked Register. Her hands shook afterward, but she smiled. At her next prenatal appointment, the doctor placed the monitor against her belly. A rapid heartbeat filled the room. Strong, steady. Hannah closed her eyes. For months, she'd imagined bringing her daughter into a life defined by everything they didn't have. No husband. No money. No security. But now she pictured something different. A little girl growing up inside the clinic her grandfather had dreamed about. A child learning that family wasn't only the people who stayed because they had to. Sometimes family was the people who showed up because they chose to. Hannah left the appointment carrying an ultrasound photograph in her purse. She drove directly to the clinic. Frank was installing cabinets when she arrived. Hannah taped the ultrasound image inside the reception desk. Frank noticed. First patient. Hannah smiled. No. She touched the picture. First reason I can't quit. Then someone knocked on the front door. Hannah turned. Dylan stood outside. He wore a dark coat and held a folder beneath one arm. Her smile disappeared. Frank lowered his drill. Hannah opened the door. Dylan looked past her at the renovated walls. His expression changed. So it's true. What? You've been spending Dad's money. I'm finishing what he started. Dylan laughed once. That's what you're calling it. Hannah felt the familiar urge to shrink. The same instinct she'd had when her husband told her he was leaving. Stay quiet. Don't make things worse. But she didn't move. Dylan opened the folder. My attorney reviewed the estate. Hannah's stomach tightened. The building is in a trust. I know. Then you know it isn't yours. It was created for me. Dylan stepped closer. Dad was 74. Hannah. He was sick. He was hiding money. Buying property nobody knew about. Driving around treating strangers out of an ambulance. You really think a judge is going to look at all that and automatically decide he was thinking clearly? The words hit harder than Hannah expected. Not because Dylan was threatening her. Because he was reducing everything Samuel had done to evidence of a confused old man. You don't get to do that. Dylan blinked. Do what? Turn Dad's kindness into an illness because you didn't profit from it. His jaw tightened. I got the house because that was what the will said. And you were happy with that until you discovered there was something else. This isn't about money. Hannah almost laughed. Then what is it about? Dylan didn't answer. That was answer enough. He handed her the folder. A legal notice. He was challenging the trust. Hannah read the first page. Her hands began trembling. Dylan noticed. You don't have to fight me. Hannah looked up. What does that mean? Sell the building? Split the money? Stop this before you waste everything Dad left? For one terrible second, Hannah imagined doing exactly that. No lawyers. No court. No risk. She could pay her rent. Prepare for the baby. Maybe even start over somewhere else. Then she looked through the open doorway. At Dorothy folding towels. At Louis carrying lumber. At Frank standing silently beside the new cabinets. At the ultrasound photograph taped beneath the reception counter. And Hannah understood something. Dylan saw a building. She saw every person Samuel had refused to abandon. She folded the legal notice. No. Dylan stared at her. No. No sale. Hannah, think about your baby. She placed one hand over her stomach. I am. Dylan shook his head. You're unemployed. You're pregnant. Your husband walked out on you. You have almost nothing, and you're willing to risk what little security you have left for strangers. The room went silent. Hannah felt every word, especially the one about her husband. For months, those facts had sounded like proof that her life was falling apart. Now they sounded different. They sounded like reasons she understood exactly what it felt like to need someone to show up. She stepped closer to her brother. Dad spent 20 years helping people who had almost nothing. Her voice softened. Right now, I finally understand why. Dylan looked at her as if she were someone he no longer recognized. Maybe she was... He turned toward the door. My attorney will be in touch. Then he left. Hannah stood motionless until his car disappeared. Only then did her knees weaken. Frank pulled over a chair. Hannah sat. She looked down at the legal notice in her hands. What if he wins? Frank didn't answer immediately. Then he crouched beside her. I don't know. Hannah's eyes filled. For once, nobody gave her a promise they couldn't keep. Frank simply placed Samuel's old medical bag on the table beside her. But I knew your father for 17 years, he said, and Samuel kept records of everything. Hannah looked at him. Frank nodded toward the journals. Everything. That night? Hannah returned to the hidden compartment in the ambulance. She searched beneath the journals. Behind the letters? Under the bank documents. And at the very bottom, she found another folder she hadn't noticed before. Inside were years of maintenance receipts, church records, patient logs, property renovation permits, letters from attorneys, and copies of Samuel's medical evaluations. Hannah slowly realized what she was holding. Her father hadn't simply dreamed about the clinic. He had documented it, planned it, protected it, and perhaps, long before Hannah knew there would ever be a fight, Samuel Whitmore had prepared for one. Hannah stayed inside the ambulance until nearly midnight. One document after another passed through her hands. Receipts, permits, medical evaluations, letters from Samuel's attorney, bank statements showing every deposit, renovation invoices dating back 9 years. There was nothing careless about any of it. Samuel hadn't hidden the clinic because he was confused. He had hidden it because he had been careful. Painfully careful. And buried among the legal documents was a letter dated 18 months before his death. It was from Samuel's attorney. The trust had been reviewed. Samuel's mental competency had been independently evaluated. The building had been transferred legally. The purpose of the trust was written in plain language: to establish and maintain a community medical clinic, with Hannah Whitmore designated as primary trustee and beneficiary responsible for carrying out its charitable purpose. Hannah read the sentence twice. Then she leaned back against the ambulance wall and closed her eyes. "Dad," she whispered. "You knew." Maybe Samuel hadn't known Dylan would challenge it. But he had known enough about people to understand that money could make grief ugly. 3 days later, Hannah met with Samuel's attorney, Margaret Cole. Margaret was 68, silver-haired, and spoke with the calm precision of someone who had spent 40 years watching families fight over things dead people could no longer explain. She studied Dylan's petition. "He's claiming diminished capacity." Hannah nodded. "Can he win?" Margaret didn't offer comfort. "He can make this expensive." Hannah's heart sank. "How expensive?" "Enough to scare you." Hannah looked down at her hands. That was probably Dylan's strategy. He knew she had almost nothing. He knew she was pregnant. He knew her husband had left. He knew every weak place in her life. For years, Dylan had been the practical one, the confident one. Hannah had been the younger sister who apologized first, backed away first, kept the peace. Maybe he was counting on her still being that woman. Margaret pushed Samuel's medical evaluation across the desk. "Your father anticipated questions about his capacity. He voluntarily underwent 2 independent evaluations." "Why?" Margaret's expression softened. "He told me he wanted there to be no doubt about what he was doing." Hannah swallowed. "Did he ever talk about me?" Margaret paused. "Constantly." Hannah looked away before the tears came. Again, another stranger telling her how much her father had loved her. Samuel had apparently spent his final years speaking her name everywhere except directly to her. The hearing was scheduled 5 weeks later. By then, Hannah was nearly 8 months pregnant. The clinic renovations continued, but every hammer strike now seemed to carry a question. Would they ever open? Would Dylan take it? Would everything Samuel built be sold before the first patient walked through the door? Then something Hannah never expected happened. People began calling Margaret. Not one. Dozens. They wanted to testify. Frank. Eleanor. Luis. Dorothy. Parents. Farm workers. Retired teachers. Veterans. People Hannah had never met. People Samuel had treated 10, 15, even 20 years earlier. Margaret finally had to create a list. "Your father left us too many witnesses," she told Hannah. The morning of the hearing, Hannah stood outside the courthouse with one hand pressed against her lower back. She hadn't slept. Her daughter had kicked most of the night. The dress she'd bought 2 weeks earlier was already too tight around her stomach. Hannah felt exposed. Young, pregnant, abandoned, terrified. Dylan arrived wearing a tailored suit beside his attorney. He looked at her belly before meeting her eyes. "You can still stop this." Hannah said nothing. "Take the settlement," he continued. "You need the money more than you need some broken-down clinic." There had been a time when that sentence would have made Hannah doubt herself. Instead, she thought of Lily. She thought of the ultrasound photograph beneath the reception desk. She thought of Samuel driving 30 miles after a 16-hour shift because a child couldn't breathe. "No," Hannah said. Dylan sighed. "You've always been emotional." Hannah looked directly at him. "And you've always mistaken that for weakness." For once, Dylan had no answer. Inside the courtroom, his attorney painted a version of Samuel that Hannah barely recognized. An elderly man. Secretive. Obsessed with helping strangers. Making unusual financial decisions. Purchasing property without telling his family. Giving medical care from an aging ambulance. Then came the sentence that made Hannah's hands curl into fists. These are not the actions of a man exercising ordinary judgment. Margaret stood. "No, they're the actions of a man exercising extraordinary compassion." The judge looked over her glasses. "Counsel?" Margaret nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." Then the evidence began. Bank records showed 20 years of disciplined savings. Property documents showed Samuel negotiated the purchase himself. Permits proved he had planned each stage of renovation. Medical evaluations performed 18 months and 6 months before his death found no cognitive impairment. Then Frank testified. He told the court about dying on the pavement, about Samuel performing CPR for 11 minutes, about waking in the hospital and realizing a stranger had refused to let him die. Eleanor testified next. Then Dorothy. Then Louise. One after another, people stood and described Samuel Whitmore. Not as confused, not as unstable, but as deliberate, reliable, stubborn, precise. A man who remembered medication schedules better than the patients taking them. A man who recorded blood pressure readings for years. A man who never promised to return unless he knew he could. Then the young mother from the pantry entered the courtroom. Lily held her hand. Hannah's breath caught. The mother testified about the winter her daughter nearly died. She had no insurance. No money. No one willing to help. Samuel came anyway. When she finished, Lily looked toward Hannah. The little girl smiled. That same tiny smile. Hannah lowered her head as tears filled her eyes. And suddenly, she understood what the courtroom was really witnessing. Samuel's defense wasn't contained in the folders. It was sitting in the benches, breathing, growing older, raising children, celebrating anniversaries, living ordinary lives because Samuel had once shown up on an extraordinary day. Then Hannah was called. She walked carefully to the witness stand. Dylan's attorney approached. "Miss Whitmore, you're currently unemployed." "Yes." "Your nursing license has been inactive." "Yes." "Your husband recently left you." Hannah's jaw tightened. "Yes." "And you're expecting a child." "Yes." "So financially, this trust is extremely valuable to you personally." There it was. The suggestion that she was no different from Dylan. That she wanted the money. Hannah looked toward her brother. Then toward the people her father had helped. "No." The attorney frowned. "No." "The money would be valuable to me." She rested one hand over her belly. "I have $212 in my personal account. My rent is behind. My daughter will be born soon. So, yes, I know exactly what that money could do for me." The courtroom was silent. "But my father didn't leave me money so I could escape being afraid." Her voice trembled. "He left me something to do while I was afraid." Margaret's eyes lowered. Frank wiped his face. Hannah continued. 7 months ago, I stopped being a nurse because I lost a 16-year-old patient. I thought one person I couldn't save meant I had no right to help anyone else." She swallowed. "My father knew better." Her voice cracked. He spent 30 years carrying people he couldn't save, and he still woke up the next morning and went back. Hannah looked toward the judge. I don't know if I can become the woman my father believed I could be. A tear rolled down her cheek. But I know I want to try. The attorney said nothing. Neither did Dylan. 2 weeks later, the ruling came. Hannah sat in Margaret's office when the phone rang. Her daughter shifted beneath her ribs. Margaret listened, said thank you, then hung up. For several seconds, she simply looked at Hannah. Hannah couldn't breathe. Well, Margaret smiled. The petition was denied. Hannah covered her mouth. The trust stands. That was all it took. Months of fear broke at once. Hannah bent forward and sobbed. Not because she'd won money, not because Dylan had lost, because Samuel's name had survived the accusation. His work had survived. His clinic had survived. His purpose had survived. And somehow, so had she? That evening, Hannah returned alone to 614 Greer Street. The clinic was almost finished. She stood inside the first exam room and took the new stethoscope from its box. For 7 months, she had been unable to touch one. Now she placed it around her neck. Her hands trembled. Then she pressed the chest piece gently against her pregnant belly. At first, she heard only movement. Then faintly, a heartbeat. Fast. Alive. Her daughters. Hannah closed her eyes. I think we're going to be okay, she whispered. For the first time, she didn't say it because she was trying to convince herself. She believed it. And in that quiet, unfinished room, Hannah finally understood that becoming strong hadn't meant becoming fearless. It meant she had stopped letting fear decide what she would do next. 3 months later, the sign finally went up. Hannah stood across Greer Street, with one hand resting beneath her belly, and watched Frank tighten the final bolt. The letters were simple. Samuel Whitmore Community Health Clinic. Walk-ins welcome. No one turned away. For a long time, Hannah couldn't speak. She had imagined this moment so many times. But Samuel wasn't standing beside her. That was the part that still hurt. She wanted to hear him complain that the sign wasn't level. She wanted to watch him pretend the attention embarrassed him. More than anything, she wanted to turn to him and say, "We did it, Dad." Frank climbed down from the ladder. Well, Hannah wiped her eyes. He would have said you hung it crooked. Frank looked up. It is crooked. Hannah laughed through her tears. And somehow, that made the moment perfect. The clinic opened the following Monday. By then, Hannah had completed the requirements to reactivate her nursing license. The first morning, she stood alone in exam room 1, wearing navy blue scrubs. Her father's stethoscope hung around her neck. For several seconds, she stared at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the nurse she'd been before. That woman had believed being good meant saving everyone. This woman knew better. She knew there would be people she couldn't save. Days when she would question herself. Nights when old memories would return. But she also knew something Samuel had spent his life understanding. You don't have to save everyone to make showing up worthwhile. At 9 o'clock, Frank unlocked the front door. There were already 14 people waiting outside. Eleanor cried when she saw them. Dorothy brought muffins. Louise arrived carrying coffee. By noon, every chair in the waiting room was full. Nobody was asked whether they could afford to be there. Nobody was turned away. Hannah worked until her feet ached. She checked blood pressure, cleaned wounds, listened to lungs, reassured frightened parents. And every time fear whispered that she wasn't ready, she touched the stethoscope around her neck. Then she kept going. Near closing time, the front door opened. Hannah looked up. Dylan stood there. For a moment, nobody spoke. He looked different. Tired, smaller somehow. He held an envelope in one hand. Hannah's body tightened instinctively. If this is about the trust, it isn't. Dylan walked toward the reception desk. I sold Dad's house. Hannah said nothing. He placed the envelope in front of her. Inside was a cashier's check. $12,000. Hannah stared at it. What is this? Half of what I had left after everything was settled. I don't want your money. I know. Dylan looked around the clinic. At the photographs of Samuel on the wall, at the waiting room, at the people still sitting patiently for help. Then his eyes filled. I thought Dad left you more because he loved you more. Hannah's expression softened. Dylan swallowed. But I think I finally understand. He looked down. He gave me what I wanted. The house, the truck, the things I could sell. Then he looked at Hannah. He gave you what he thought you needed. Hannah's eyes filled. Dylan pushed the check toward her. This isn't me buying forgiveness. He paused. I don't think I've earned that yet. Then what is it? His voice broke. It's me trying to understand Dad before it's too late for me. For several seconds, Hannah simply looked at her brother. Then she stepped around the desk and hugged him. Dylan froze. Slowly, his arms came around her. They stood there beneath Samuel's photograph. Two children who had inherited different pieces of the same man. Neither of them noticed Frank quietly leave the room. 6 weeks later, Hannah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Clara Samuel Whitmore. Samuel for the grandfather she would never meet. On Hannah's first day back at the clinic after maternity leave, Clara slept in a bassinet behind the reception desk. Late that afternoon, the door opened. A young mother rushed inside, carrying a little boy against her chest. His cheeks were flushed. His breathing was shallow. The woman looked frightened. Is this the clinic? Hannah stood immediately. I heard you don't turn people away. For 1 second, the room disappeared. Hannah saw the old ambulance. The hidden compartment. The journals. The letters. Her father's handwriting. The courtroom. The unfinished walls. The night she had sat alone with $212 and wondered how she would raise a child without a husband, without a job, without her father. Then she looked toward the bassinet. Clara was sleeping peacefully. Frank was repairing a cabinet in the hallway. Eleanor was organizing donated supplies. And Samuel's photograph hung beside the entrance. Hannah smiled. That's right. She opened the exam room door. Come on in. The mother carried her son past her. Hannah reached for the stethoscope around her neck. Samuel's stethoscope. And as she followed them into the room, she finally understood what her father had truly left her. It wasn't 43-217. It wasn't a building. It wasn't even the ambulance. He had left her a reason to get out of bed when grief told her to stay down. A reason to believe that being abandoned didn't mean she was alone. A reason to understand that one life she couldn't save did not erase all the lives she still might touch. Hannah had once believed her father left her the least valuable thing he owned. A rusted ambulance nobody wanted. But sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't something that makes your life easier. Sometimes it's something that reminds you why your life still matters. Samuel Whitmore spent his life showing up for people who thought nobody was coming. And when his own daughter became one of those people, he showed up for her too. Even after he was gone, there is something Hannah learned that no inheritance document could ever explain. Sometimes life doesn't break us all at once. It takes things slowly. A person we love, a career we were proud of, a marriage we believed would last, a dream we thought we still had time to reach. And after enough losses, we begin to believe that what disappeared must have taken our future with it. Hannah believed that, at 25, 6 months pregnant and abandoned by her husband, she had $212, no job, and a nursing uniform she could no longer bring herself to wear. She thought her life was ending. But sometimes what feels like an ending is simply the place where a different life begins. Samuel couldn't protect his daughter from heartbreak. He couldn't make her husband stay. He couldn't erase the memory of the patient she couldn't save. And he couldn't live long enough to hold his granddaughter. But he could leave Hannah something stronger than protection. Purpose. That's what changed her. Not the 43 217s. Not the building. Not even the ambulance. Purpose gave her a reason to stand when grief told her to stay down. And maybe someone listening to this story needs that reminder today. You may have lost someone. You may have been abandoned by someone you trusted. You may carry a mistake you would give anything to change. But the worst chapter of your life does not get to decide how your story ends. You can still begin again. You can still matter to someone. You can still turn your pain into a reason another person doesn't have to face theirs alone. And sometimes, the greatest way to honor the people we've lost is not to spend the rest of our lives grieving how they left, but living differently because they were here. If Hannah's story touched your heart, tell me in the comments. What is one lesson someone you loved left behind that you still carry today? And if you believe kindness can outlive the person who gave it, please like this video, subscribe, and share this story with someone who may need to hear it. Because somewhere tonight, someone feels forgotten. Someone believes nobody is coming. And maybe your kindness, your phone call, your decision to show up, could become the reason they don't give up. Just as Samuel once did, and just as Hannah finally learned to do